The HOA invaded my private lake and built their luxury floating restaurant, right in my face. 6 hours before opening, I confronted Cordelia Blackthorne on my dock at sunrise. Their monstrosity gleamed: white marble pavilion, crystal chandeliers, tables for 200 with gold-rimmed china. Lobster and truffle smells wafted over. Staff scrambled for VIPs, news crews, the mayor. She smirked straight at me.
Your easement loophole from the 1920s gave us rights. This is OUR spot now. Get over your dead wife's little sunset memories.
That hit hard. This was the peaceful place my late wife and I cherished every evening. She'd turned my grief into her greedy empire. But she didn't know. My grandfather's hidden clause in the century-old deed let me revoke it all. Instantly, legally. In 6 hours, I'd open the drain. The lake would empty. Her restaurant would crash into mud. Her smug face, about to shatter. Stick around. The meltdown is epic. What would you do if she taunted you like that? Let me back up 6 months and tell you how this nightmare started. My name's Jake Morrison, 52, retired Army Corps of Engineers. I inherited 40 acres of pristine wilderness from my grandfather, including a crystal-clear, spring-fed lake that's been in our family since 1923. The smell of pine sap, mixed with wild honeysuckle, still takes me back to childhood summers learning to fish in that perfect water. My late wife Sarah and I spent 30 years building our dream here. Every evening, we'd sit on the hand-hewn dock, listening to loons call across the water, while wood smoke from our cabin chimney drifted through ancient oak branches. She'd sketch wildflowers, I'd plan tomorrow's projects. The gentle lap of waves against weathered dock posts became our evening lullaby. When cancer took Sarah 2 years ago, I scattered her ashes under the memorial oak by the water's edge, the same tree where we'd carved our initials 30 years earlier. Her final words: "Promise me this place stays peaceful forever." I gave her my word. Then Cordelia Blackthorne moved into the new subdivision next door and decided my grief was bad for property values. Picture a woman who treats everything like a hostile takeover. Perfectly manicured talons that drummed impatiently on mahogany steering wheels. White Escalade that reeked of expensive perfume and barely contained rage. Real estate agent who'd failed upward into HOA presidency after 3 bankruptcies in other states, though I wouldn't learn that delightful detail until later. The woman could turn a compliment into an insult faster than you could say, property assessment. It started one Tuesday morning when Cordelia showed up uninvited with a clipboard and measuring tape. The aggressive crunch of designer heels on my gravel driveway announced her arrival like combat boots on broken glass. "Mr. Morrison, I'm conducting mandatory community compliance review," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "Your waterfront setup violates multiple setback ordinances." I watched her march toward my dock like Sherman heading to Atlanta. "Ma'am, this property was grandfathered in decades before your subdivision existed. Everything here is completely legal." She whipped out an official-looking survey that still smelled like fresh printer toner. According to updated boundary assessments, the community property line runs through the center of this lake. You're illegally monopolizing shared water resources. The paper was so crisp it practically crackled with lies. I retrieved my grandfather's original deed, genuine 1923 parchment that felt like silk and bore the raised county seal. "Here's the actual survey, ma'am. My property extends 50 feet beyond the far shoreline." Her face went through more color changes than a mood ring. She'd clearly expected some confused old hermit who'd roll over at the first sign of official paperwork. "Mr. Morrison," she said, switching to that special condescending tone people use when they're about to screw you sideways. "This community has evolved. We can't have one selfish individual hoarding premium waterfront while property values suffer." She gestured toward my hand-built cabin like it was a meth lab. "A man of your background surely understands the value of strategic repositioning. There are lovely senior communities where someone your age could live more appropriately." The dismissal hit like a slap. This woman saw my life's work, my wife's memory, my family's century-old legacy as nothing more than an obstacle to her personal profit. "Ma'am, my wife's ashes rest under that oak tree. This property stays in my family until I'm dead. If you have legal concerns, hire a lawyer." Her smile turned arctic. "Oh, sweetie, I don't think you grasp how community development works in the modern era. This lake represents millions in untapped commercial potential. She climbed into her pollution mobile, leaving behind tire ruts in my driveway and the acrid stench of burning entitlement. Her parting shot echoed across the peaceful water. This community deserves better than your hillbilly compound, Jake. Change is coming, whether you like it or not. That's when I realized this wasn't about ordinances or property values. This was war. She just didn't know she'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent 30 years learning how water systems work. The harassment started immediately. Within a week, I had 3 HOA violation notices taped to my front door. Excessive vegetation for the wildflowers Sarah had planted. Noise ordinance violation for splitting firewood at 7 a.m. Unpermitted structures for my grandfather's original storage shed. Each citation came with a $500 fine and Cordelia's flowing signature, complete with little hearts dotting her eyes. Because nothing says community standards like passive-aggressive calligraphy. I paid exactly $0 in fines. During my Army days, I'd learned that when someone attacks with paperwork, you respond with research. Turns out, HOAs can only enforce rules on properties that voluntarily join their association through signed covenants. My grandfather's 1923 homestead was legally untouchable, unless I'd explicitly surrendered those rights through written agreement, which I obviously hadn't. The manila folder on my kitchen table grew thicker daily as I documented every violation notice with timestamps and photos. The satisfying snap of 3-ring binder clips became my favorite sound as I organized evidence of Cordelia's systematic harassment campaign. Anonymous complaints started flooding the county office about my dangerous military equipment and potential environmental hazards. The metallic ping of surveyor stakes being hammered into my property at dawn became my new alarm clock as various inspectors trudged across my land investigating these mysterious reports. County health inspector, fire marshal, building code enforcement, they all found the same thing. My property exceeded every safety and environmental standard. The eco-friendly composting system I'd installed actually worked better than most modern septic setups. Inspector Williams confided after his 3rd visit, "Mr. Morrison, that woman's been calling twice a week for months. I had to come out here just to shut her up. Your place is cleaner than most city parks." The poor man looked genuinely exhausted by Cordelia's relentless bureaucratic assault. That's when I installed security cameras. The scratchy whir of night vision equipment captured some fascinating late-night footage. Cordelia conducting property assessments with her measuring tape and flashlight. Unknown vehicles driving slowly past my gate at 2 a.m. Someone attempting to vandalize my boundary markers, though they scattered like cockroaches when my motion-activated lights blazed to life. But the real shock came when I discovered what Cordelia was doing during her legitimate daytime visits. She was showing my property to potential buyers. I stumbled across real estate listings online that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Prime commercial waterfront requiring responsible development, complete with photos of my dock, my cabin, my memorial oak tree, all presented as community amenities awaiting proper management. The description was even worse. Unique opportunity to acquire underutilized lakefront property currently occupied by elderly hermit unwilling to embrace community progress. Seller motivated for quick sale to qualified commercial developers. She was marketing my home while I was still living in it. The woman had balls, I'll give her that. My research into Cordelia's background revealed a pattern more predictable than morning coffee. 3 failed real estate ventures across 2 states. A specialty in targeting elderly property owners near lakes and rivers. 2 bankruptcy filings, both mysteriously dismissed after last-minute financial settlements. This wasn't personal harassment. This was professional predation. The campaign escalated when Cordelia organized a neighborhood petition, demanding my property be declared a public nuisance. She went door to door warning new residents about the unstable veteran living on their lake, describing my morning wood-splitting routine as threatening behavior from a potentially dangerous individual with PTSD. The smell of fresh printed flyers filled my mailbox daily, each one more creative than the last in explaining how my existence threatened their children's safety and their property values. My personal favorite claimed I was stockpiling military weapons for unknown purposes. Apparently, my grandfather's antique hunting rifles qualified as an arsenal. But Cordelia had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I'd roll over like her previous victims. I contacted my lawyer friend from Army days, Tom Bradley, who specialized in property law. After reviewing my documentation, he laughed so hard I thought he might need medical attention. "Jake, this woman has zero legal standing. You're not even in their jurisdiction. But keep documenting everything. She's creating a textbook harassment case against herself." Meanwhile, my evening research sessions revealed that Cordelia was skimming HOA funds for administrative costs that included her personal car payments and monthly spa treatments. The association's financial records, supposedly public information, had conveniently vanished from their website right around the time her spending increased. My countermove was beautifully simple. I started attending HOA meetings. Nothing rattles control freaks like unexpected witnesses. Cordelia's perfectly rehearsed presentations turned into stuttering damage control whenever I raised my hand to ask about missing financial records or the legal basis for their authority over non-member properties. The nervous crunch of gravel under folding chairs filled the community center as residents shifted uncomfortably during these exchanges. Some brave souls started asking their own questions about where their monthly fees were actually going. That's when Cordelia realized her harassment strategy wasn't working fast enough. She needed a bigger weapon. Time to escalate to phase 2 of her master plan. Cordelia's next move was pure genius. Evil genius, but genius nonetheless. She claimed to have discovered a 1920s water access easement that gave the entire community rights to my lake. The document looked official enough, complete with tea-stained paper and a county seal that still smelled faintly of fresh ink from whatever print shop she'd used. The morning she presented this historical discovery to the HOA board, I could hear the excitement in residents' voices through my open cabin windows. The sound carried across the water like gossip at a church picnic. Everyone suddenly convinced they owned a piece of my family's sanctuary. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cordelia announced at an emergency meeting, "this changes everything. The Morrison property was never exclusively private. Our entire community has legal water access dating back to the original homestead agreements." Her hired gun, some maritime lawyer in a $1,000 suit who probably specialized in turning puddles into international shipping lanes, presented their case with PowerPoint slides and nautical charts. According to their theory, my spring-fed lake qualified as navigable waters under federal jurisdiction, making any commercial restrictions a violation of interstate commerce laws. I sat in the back row, the metallic click of my ballpoint pen, the only sound as I took detailed notes. During my Army engineering days, I'd learned that when someone attacks with fake documents, you respond with real research. Historical property easements are public record, if you know where to look. The 1920s easement was real, but it was specifically for emergency well water during drought conditions, not recreational lake access. The original language stated domestic water supply only, during times of municipal shortage, and had automatically expired when city water lines reached our area in 1952. Any lawyer worth his bar exam should have caught that detail. But I let Cordelia finish her presentation. Never interrupt your enemy when they're digging their own grave. The mini twist came 3 days later when a restaurant investor rang my doorbell at 7 a.m. Marcus Samuel stood on my porch holding architectural blueprints and wearing the shell-shocked expression of a man who just realized he'd been royally screwed. The crisp morning air carried the scent of his expensive cologne, mixed with what smelled suspiciously like panic sweat. "Mr. Morrison," he said, checking his phone's GPS against my property markers, "I need to ask you something important. Did you or did you not agree to lease waterfront space for a commercial dining facility?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "I'm sorry, what restaurant?" Marcus unrolled blueprints showing a floating dining pavilion designed for my exact lake dimensions, complete with kitchen specifications and seating arrangements for 150 guests. "Ms. Blackthorne collected my $75,000 development deposit 3 weeks ago. She said you were eager to begin construction on the community restaurant project." The pieces clicked together like a perfectly assembled puzzle. Cordelia wasn't just harassing me. She was running a sophisticated investment scam, using my property as collateral she didn't own. "Mr. Samuel," I said carefully, "I never agreed to any restaurant lease. This woman has zero authority to negotiate anything involving my property." His face cycled through several shades of red as he realized the scope of Cordelia's deception. Turns out, she'd approached at least 6 different investors with the same exclusive development opportunity, collecting substantial deposits while promising guaranteed returns from a lakefront dining establishment that would never legally exist. Marcus became my first ally in documenting Cordelia's fraud. He provided copies of signed agreements, email chains discussing menu concepts, and financial records showing exactly how much money she'd stolen from trusting investors, who thought they were buying into the next big restaurant trend. I spent that afternoon installing professional-grade steel property markers with concrete footings and GPS coordinates. The satisfying thunk of the post-hole digger hitting bedrock reminded me that some battles require proper defensive fortifications. During military surveying operations, I'd learned that disputed boundaries disappear when you establish unshakable physical evidence. My surveyor confirmed what 3 generations of county records already proved. My property line extended well beyond the lake's far shore. Any structure built on that water would be completely within my private boundaries, making Cordelia's restaurant scheme not just fraudulent, but technically criminal trespassing. But instead of backing down, she doubled down with breathtaking audacity. Cordelia organized daily community wellness walks that happened to pass directly through my property, groups of residents following her lead like lemmings, trampling Sarah's memorial wildflowers while discussing their upcoming shared lake privileges and pointing out ideal spots for picnic tables. The rhythmic crunch of unauthorized footsteps on my gravel paths became a daily soundtrack of invasion. Every step was being recorded by my security cameras, every trespass documented for future legal proceedings. But the most infuriating part was watching neighbors I'd known for years get swept up in Cordelia's lies, convinced that my grief-stricken isolation somehow made my property community property. She thought she was building an unstoppable, legal, and financial steamroller. What she didn't know was that I'd found something in my grandfather's papers that would stop her cold. 3 months before the grand opening, Cordelia made it official. She announced that the HOA was partnering with Lakeside Dining Experiences, LLC, to build a luxury floating restaurant on what she now boldly called community water. The glossy brochures that appeared in every mailbox promised property values would skyrocket once their innovative waterfront dining destination opened for business. The smell of fresh printer ink from hundreds of promotional flyers filled the morning air as Cordelia's army of volunteers distributed marketing materials like propaganda leaflets. Each brochure featured artist renderings of an elegant pavilion floating serenely on crystal water, complete with white tablecloths and champagne service under twinkling lights. What the brochures didn't mention was that I'd spent my weekend researching Lakeside Dining Experiences, LLC, through state business records. Turns out, the company had been registered exactly 3 weeks earlier, with Cordelia Blackthorne as sole owner, operator, and beneficiary. The woman was essentially building herself a restaurant on stolen land and calling it community development. You've got to admire the audacity, even when it's completely illegal. Construction began on a Tuesday morning with the roar of diesel engines shattering my usual dawn peace. Industrial barges and pile-driving equipment arrived at my private shoreline like an invading army, complete with hard-hatted soldiers who clearly had no idea they were trespassing. I walked down to meet the construction foreman, a sun-weathered man named Rodriguez, who looked genuinely puzzled when I introduced myself as the actual property owner. The metallic clang of equipment being unloaded echoed across the water as his crew continued working behind him. "Ma'am told us this was community development on public waterfront," he said, checking his clipboard of work orders. "We got county permits and environmental clearances." He handed me a thick stack of documents bearing official letterhead and what appeared to be legitimate government seals. Everything looked perfect, except for one tiny detail that made my blood pressure spike: my signature on the environmental impact waiver. I stared at the flowing script that supposedly represented my written consent to build a commercial dining facility on my private lake. Someone had clearly practiced my signature, but after 52 years of signing my own name, I could spot the subtle differences. The J was too rounded, the M too sharp, and my middle initial was positioned wrong. During my Army days, I'd processed enough forged documents to recognize amateur hour when I saw it. "Mr. Rodriguez," I said carefully, "I never signed any of these permits. Someone used my name and property without permission. That's fraud." His crew stopped working immediately. The sudden silence felt deafening after the constant noise of construction equipment. Nobody wants to build on disputed property, especially when the actual owner is standing there explaining that the paperwork is fake. Cordelia arrived within minutes, her white Escalade's tires spraying gravel as she screeched into my driveway. The sharp click of designer heels on dock boards announced her arrival like warning shots as she marched toward the confrontation. "Mr. Morrison, these professionals have contracted work to complete," she announced, with the confidence of someone who'd convinced herself that reality was negotiable. "Community development permits are filed, timelines are established, and your cooperation is legally mandated under established water access protocols." I held up the forged document. "Cordelia, you falsified my signature on legal paperwork. That's not cooperation. That's a felony." For just a moment, her perfectly controlled expression cracked. She'd been so busy managing investors and construction crews that she'd apparently forgotten about the inconvenient detail of actually getting permission from the property owner. "That's a serious accusation based on what could easily be administrative oversight," she said, switching to her corporate crisis management voice. "Filing processes sometimes involve clerical approximations of property owner consent." "Clerical approximations?" I couldn't help laughing. "Cordelia, that's the most creative way I've ever heard someone describe criminal forgery." But the mini twist came when Rodriguez pulled me aside while Cordelia argued with her assistant about permit authenticity protocols. "Mr. Morrison," he whispered, "this lady's been acting strange from day one. Paid our deposit in cash, insisted we start work before final inspections, and keeps changing the restaurant specifications. Yesterday she asked if we could install hidden compartments in the kitchen for specialized storage solutions." The pieces clicked together. Cordelia wasn't just building an illegal restaurant. She was creating some kind of money laundering operation, disguised as community dining. The woman had graduated from simple fraud to organized financial crime. That evening, I discovered the full scope of her desperation. Property records showed she'd borrowed $400,000 against her house to fund this project, convinced that investor deposits would cover costs until profits materialized. She was risking bankruptcy and prison time for a restaurant that would never legally serve its first meal. But Cordelia had committed too deeply to back down now. She'd found a new construction company willing to work with flexible documentation requirements, probably the kind of operation that built without asking inconvenient questions about permits. The restaurant was going to be built, whether I liked it or not. Time to find out what my grandfather had left me to fight back. 2 months before opening day, I finally decided to clean out my grandfather's basement. I'd been avoiding this task since Sarah's funeral, partly from grief, and partly because the old man had been a legendary pack rat. The basement smelled like aged leather and forgotten memories. That distinctive scent of old paper mixed with cedar wood and the faint ghost of my grandmother's lavender sachets. Descending those creaking wooden steps felt like entering a museum of my family's history. Cardboard boxes lined the fieldstone walls like archaeological layers, each representing a different decade of my grandfather's obsessive record-keeping. The man had saved everything: receipts from 1943, warranty cards for farm equipment that had rusted away decades ago, and enough National Geographic magazines to build a fort. But tucked away in a cedar trunk beneath my grandmother's hand-stitched quilts, I found something that changed everything: my grandfather's complete legal files from the 1920s homestead establishment. The documents were wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, like he'd known they'd be important someday. As I unfolded the yellowed pages, the brittle paper crackling under my fingers, I realized this wasn't just property ownership paperwork. It was a complete water management contract with the county. According to the official agreement, my grandfather had been designated as the watershed's flood control coordinator, responsible for managing water levels during seasonal flooding that used to devastate downstream communities before modern drainage systems existed. The contract language made my heart race. Property owner maintains exclusive authority to control, divert, or drain water levels as necessary for flood prevention and community safety. It was signed by the county commissioner in 1923, witnessed by 3 officials, and bore the raised county seal that proved its legal authenticity. But here's the part that made me laugh out loud in that dusty basement. The contract included emergency drainage provisions. My grandfather had installed a sophisticated manual spillway system, complete with underground culverts and controlled release gates that could completely drain the lake within 6 hours if flooding threatened downstream properties. The county had actually paid him annual fees for maintaining this critical flood control service, money that nobody had bothered to collect in 40 years. I found his maintenance manual tucked inside the contract folder, written in that precise engineer's handwriting I remembered from childhood. Detailed diagrams showed exactly how the drainage system worked, including step-by-step procedures for emergency water release operations that would make the lake disappear faster than a magic trick. Those mysterious concrete structures I'd always noticed around the lake's edges weren't decorative landscaping. They were components of a Depression-era engineering marvel that gave me absolute legal authority over every drop of water on my property. Standing in that basement, surrounded by my grandfather's legacy, I thought about Sarah's final words. Promise me this place stays peaceful forever. She'd never lived to see Cordelia's invasion, but somehow I knew she'd approve of using family history to defend family land. Under this century-old contract, any permanent structure on the lake's surface constituted an obstruction to emergency flood control operations, subject to immediate removal. The county would be legally obligated to support my water management decisions, regardless of HOA claims or fraudulent development permits. I drove straight to the county engineering office with photocopies of every document. The current water management coordinator, a earnest young engineer named Stevens, looked amazed as he verified the papers against historical records. "Mr. Morrison, this contract is completely valid," he confirmed. "Your family has been our official watershed manager for nearly a century. When would you like to schedule your next flood control maintenance?" I smiled, picturing Cordelia's expensive floating restaurant sitting helplessly in mud. "How about Saturday morning at 11 a.m.? I think it's time for some long overdue system testing." The trap was set. Cordelia thought she controlled the lake. I controlled the drain plug. 6 weeks before the grand opening, I began assembling my team. First call went to my old Army buddy, Colonel Mike Patterson, now retired and running a consulting firm that specialized in emergency infrastructure operations. The man had supervised more controlled demolitions and drainage projects than anyone in 3 states. Plus, he owed me a favor from our deployment days when I'd kept his convoy out of an IED field. "Jake, you want me to witness what, exactly?" he asked, barely containing his amusement. "Legal flood control maintenance on a Depression-era spillway system. Completely legitimate county contract from 1923. But I need official documentation that everything's done by the book." The metallic click of his lighter came through the phone as Mike lit one of his perpetual cigars. "Brother, after 30 years of watching bureaucrats screw up perfectly good engineering projects, I'd love to see some old-school craftsmanship in action. Plus, this sounds way more entertaining than my usual consulting gigs." Next, I contacted Stevens, the young county engineer who'd verified my grandfather's water management contract. Turned out the kid was an engineering history enthusiast who practically bounced with excitement when I described the manual spillway system still functioning after nearly a century. "Mr. Morrison, systems like this are incredibly rare," he said, reviewing my grandfather's original construction diagrams. "Most were destroyed during modernization projects in the 1960s. The engineering principles are fascinating. Your grandfather essentially built a giant manual bathtub drain with precise flow controls. During my research, I'd learned that manual spillway systems were masterpieces of Depression-era engineering, designed when labor was cheap but materials had to last forever. These systems used gravity and mechanical advantage instead of electrical components, making them virtually indestructible and completely reliable, even after decades of neglect. The physical preparation was beautifully straightforward. My grandfather's spillway gates operated like bank vault mechanisms, massive steel wheels that opened underground channels with smooth precision that would shame modern automated systems. Each component had been handcrafted by artisans who took pride in building things that actually worked. Testing the drainage system filled me with respect for my grandfather's engineering genius. The main spillway could release water at precisely controlled rates, while emergency gates could completely drain the lake within 6 hours without causing downstream flooding or erosion damage. The whole network used gravity flow through underground culverts that fed into Mill Creek's natural drainage system. I spent afternoons learning the manual controls, the satisfying clank of well-oiled mechanisms, reminding me that some technology gets better with age instead of worse. The smell of aged steel and machine oil brought back memories of working alongside my grandfather as a kid, watching him maintain equipment with the patience of a master craftsman. Community support grew as I reached out to original neighbors, families who'd lived here since before Cordelia's subdivision carved up the countryside. Tom and Martha Hendricks, whose farm bordered my eastern property line, had actually watched my grandfather build the spillway system as children during the 1920s. "Jake, your granddad saved our farm 3 times during spring flooding," Tom told me over coffee on his weathered porch. The morning air carried the familiar scent of hay and honeysuckle as we discussed the upcoming maintenance operation. "County folks always said he was the smartest water engineer they'd ever worked with," Martha laughed, adding, "We used to sneak over and watch him test those spillway gates. Made the biggest whirlpools you ever saw when all that water went rushing through the underground channels." The most crucial preparation was legal documentation. I filed official notice with the county about routine flood control system maintenance, scheduled for the exact weekend of Cordelia's restaurant opening. Stevens helped complete every form, ensuring that the operation would be conducted through proper governmental channels with full official approval. Local media interest surprised me. Rebecca Walsh, editor of the county newspaper, requested permission to document the maintenance operation for a feature story about Depression-era engineering innovations that were still protecting modern communities. "Mr. Morrison, this is exactly the kind of local history we should be preserving," she said, examining my grandfather's original construction photographs. "People don't realize how much brilliant engineering went into early infrastructure projects." Even Sheriff's Deputy Clark expressed interest after I explained the legal situation. The longtime resident remembered my grandfather conducting annual maintenance when he was a kid. "Jake, watching that lake disappear was the coolest thing ever. Like somebody pulled a giant bathtub plug and all the water just vanished," he told me with obvious nostalgia. "Your granddad always let us kids watch from the safe distance while he operated those big wheel valves." Meanwhile, Cordelia's restaurant construction reached final stages. The floating platform gleamed white against dark water, complete with elegant dining pavilions and professional kitchen equipment that probably cost more than most people's houses. By Friday evening, everything was perfectly positioned. Official witnesses, legal documentation, media coverage, and a flood control system that had been waiting nearly a century for this exact moment. Cordelia thought she'd conquered my water through legal manipulation and financial pressure. She was about to discover the difference between stealing property and understanding infrastructure. 1 month before opening day, Cordelia's desperation reached pathological levels. She'd mortgaged everything on the restaurant scheme: her house, her reputation, and apparently her remaining sanity. When rumors spread that I'd been meeting with county engineers about water management issues, she launched a full-scale assault on reality itself. First came the clumsy bribery attempts. County Commissioner Bradley found an envelope containing $3,000 cash taped under his car's windshield wiper, along with a note suggesting my water management contract could be administratively revised for the greater community good. The man brought it straight to my door, still shaking his head in disbelief. "Jake, I've seen desperate people before, but this woman's lost her mind," he said, handing me the envelope that still reeked of Cordelia's vanilla perfume. "She actually thinks she can buy her way out of a century-old legal contract." When bribery failed, she escalated to amateur sabotage that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. My security cameras captured midnight footage of Cordelia sneaking around my spillway system, wearing all black clothing that made her look like a suburban ninja. She'd armed herself with a crowbar and bolt cutters, apparently believing she could disable Depression-era engineering with hardware store tools. The infrared video showed her wrestling with gate mechanisms that had been built to withstand spring floods, not real estate agents having nervous breakdowns. After 20 minutes of futile prying and increasingly creative profanity, she managed to scratch some paint before discovering that my grandfather had designed his infrastructure to outlast civilization itself. I found her designer crowbar abandoned in the morning dew, along with a torn piece of expensive black fabric that had snagged on the protective fencing. The woman had literally left evidence of her own crimes, scattered around my property like breadcrumbs. But the mini twist that changed everything came when she made the mistake of hiring someone with actual professional skills. Marcus Webb, a weaselly private investigator who specialized in reputation management for desperate clients, approached me at Murphy's hardware store on Tuesday morning. The man followed me through 3 aisles, reeking of cheap aftershave and desperation, while trying to pump me for dirt about my military service. "Mr. Morrison, I represent concerned community members who have questions about your background," he said, pretending to examine paintbrushes. "There are rumors about discharge circumstances, possible anger management issues, maybe some incidents involving weapons or authority figures." I continued selecting plumbing supplies while this amateur tried his intimidation routine. "Mr. Webb, you're working for someone who's about to be indicted for fraud. The question is whether you're smart enough to distance yourself before you become an accessory." His confident smirk evaporated faster than morning mist. "I don't know anything about fraud." "Really?" "Because Cordelia Blackthorne has been running investor scams across 3 states, and private investigators who help obstruct justice tend to lose their licenses. Sometimes they lose more than that." Webb's face went through more color changes than a mood ring as he realized he'd been hired by someone whose legal troubles were multiplying daily. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hardware store as he practically ran for the exit, leaving behind his business card and probably a few years of life expectancy. But here's where things got interesting. Webb had actually done his homework before approaching me. He'd discovered that I'd been conducting legitimate flood control research with county engineers, preparing for routine maintenance on infrastructure that predated Cordelia's subdivision by decades. Instead of finding military scandals, he'd uncovered evidence that I had absolute legal authority to manage water levels on my property. Webb contacted Cordelia to explain that harassing me was not only pointless, but potentially criminal. Her response was to fire him immediately and demand a refund of his $5,000 retainer fee. That's when Webb decided to switch sides and offer his services to me instead. "Mr. Morrison, your HOA president is completely unhinged," he told me during a coffee meeting downtown. The acrid smell of burnt espresso mixed with his nervous perspiration as he explained what he'd discovered during his investigation. "She's facing bankruptcy, investor lawsuits, and possible criminal charges. The restaurant is her last, desperate attempt to avoid complete financial ruin." Webb provided copies of Cordelia's financial records, showing she'd borrowed against her house, maxed out credit cards, and spent investor deposits on personal expenses. The woman was essentially broke, betting everything on a restaurant that would never legally open. Meanwhile, her media campaign reached new heights of absurdity. She organized protests featuring paid actors holding signs, demanding my property be condemned as a terrorist training facility. The fake outrage was so obvious that several real neighbors showed up to counter-protest her protesters. Social media posts described my grandfather's spillway system as a water weaponization project, designed to threaten innocent downstream communities. She actually claimed that routine flood control maintenance constituted domestic terrorism against the HOA. But her biggest mistake was threatening county officials who supported my legal water management authority. She filed formal complaints demanding Stevens be fired for colluding with dangerous individuals, and tried to organize a recall campaign against Commissioner Bradley for corruption and veteran favoritism. That's when local law enforcement decided Cordelia had crossed the line from nuisance to actual threat. The restaurant opening was 1 week away, and she was about to discover that some battles can't be won through lies and harassment. 2 weeks before opening day, Cordelia's restaurant reached completion, and so did her complete mental breakdown. The floating platform gleamed like a luxury yacht against the dark water, complete with white marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and professional kitchen equipment that probably cost more than most people's houses. The morning air carried the rich aroma of truffle oil and imported seafood, as catering staff conducted final menu testing under Cordelia's increasingly frantic supervision. She'd spared absolutely no expense on this monument to her own ego. Maine lobster, French champagne, Italian marble, and enough gold-plated fixtures to stock a jewelry store. The woman had essentially built a floating palace on my family's lake using other people's money. Daily press conferences on my dock, without permission, naturally, featured Cordelia describing the transformative community partnership that would put our area on the culinary map. Local TV stations loved the story, broadcasting glossy segments about the visionary HOA president revolutionizing rural dining. Behind the public relations circus, however, Cordelia was unraveling faster than cheap rope. Health Inspector Rodriguez arrived Friday morning for the mandatory pre-opening inspection, his clipboard, an official county badge, cutting through Cordelia's cheerful facade like a scythe through wheat. The metallic click of his pen against aluminum clipboard echoed across the water as he documented violation after violation. "Ma'am, these construction permits show clear evidence of document forgery," he said, examining the paperwork with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every scam in the book. "The county seals are fake, the signatures don't match our records, and this environmental impact statement was never actually filed." Cordelia's perfectly controlled smile began twitching at the corners. "Surely there's been some administrative oversight. Perhaps we could discuss this more privately?" The woman actually reached into her designer purse and pulled out an envelope stuffed with cash, apparently believing she could bribe a county official in broad daylight. Rodriguez looked so offended, I thought he might arrest her on the spot. "Ma'am, are you attempting to offer me money to ignore safety violations?" he asked, his voice carrying across the water, loud enough for the catering staff to hear. "I'm simply suggesting that paperwork issues shouldn't prevent community progress," she replied, still holding the envelope like it was completely normal to wave cash at government inspectors. Rodriguez shut down the restaurant immediately, posting bright red condemnation notices that fluttered in the breeze like warning flags. The facility would remain closed until legitimate permits were produced. Permits that would never exist because the entire project was built on criminal fraud. But here's where Cordelia's desperation reached truly spectacular heights. She called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening, announcing to a packed community center that the restaurant would open on schedule regardless of bureaucratic sabotage from corrupt county officials. "This community has invested too much to let small-minded government employees destroy our vision," she declared, her voice rising to near hysteria levels. The smell of her anxiety mixed with vanilla perfume created an almost toxic cloud around the podium. That's when the mini twist exploded in her face like a hand grenade. Treasury Secretary Janet Mills stood up with a thick folder of financial documents, her normally quiet voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Cordelia, I need to ask you something in front of everyone. Where is the $120,000 in HOA emergency funds?" The room went dead silent, except for the nervous creak of folding chairs, as residents leaned forward to hear the answer to a question that would destroy everything. "Those funds were properly allocated for approved community development projects," Cordelia replied, but her voice had developed a noticeable tremor. "What approved projects?" Mills shot back, opening her folder to reveal months of unauthorized transactions. "You've been writing checks to restaurant suppliers, construction companies, and catering services without any board approval. You've stolen over $100,000 from this community." The explosion of angry voices nearly drowned out Cordelia's attempts to explain how embezzlement was actually strategic community investment. Residents demanded immediate refunds, threatened lawsuits, and several people started calling the police right there in the meeting. But Cordelia's final meltdown was truly spectacular. She screamed at her own board members, accused neighbors of sabotaging community progress, and declared that the restaurant would open tomorrow, even if she had to serve guests herself. "You're all too small-minded to appreciate visionary leadership," she shrieked, storming out of the meeting while residents sat in stunned silence. Meanwhile, my final preparations proceeded with military precision. County Engineer Stevens had completed all official documentation for Saturday morning's flood control maintenance, ensuring every procedure would be conducted through proper governmental channels. Colonel Patterson arrived Friday evening, bringing professional photography equipment and enough credentials to satisfy any legal challenge. The man was practically vibrating with excitement about documenting Depression-era engineering excellence. "Jake, this is going to be beautiful," he said, examining my grandfather's spillway controls. "Watching precision craftsmanship in action is like seeing art come alive." Saturday morning would bring perfect weather, legitimate witnesses, and the most expensive lesson in property law our county had ever witnessed. Cordelia was about to discover that some engineering is more permanent than criminal schemes, Saturday morning arrived with crystal clear skies and the kind of perfect weather that makes criminals feel invincible. By 10:30 a.m., the floating restaurant buzzed with final preparations, despite having no legal permits to operate. Cordelia had decided to proceed with her grand opening, regardless of county condemnation orders, apparently believing that enough audacity could overcome reality itself. VIP guests began arriving in luxury cars that crunched across my gravel driveway without permission. Mayor Thompson, 3 county commissioners, local business leaders, and a reporter from the state newspaper, all dressed in their finest clothes for what they believed would be an elegant lakeside dining experience. The morning air carried the rich aroma of imported lobster and expensive wine as catering staff made final preparations on the gleaming white platform. Crystal glasses clinked softly in the breeze, while Cordelia greeted her guests with the manic energy of someone whose entire world was about to collapse. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future of community dining," she announced through a portable microphone, her voice echoing across the water. "Today marks a new era of cooperation between visionary leadership and responsible development." I stood at my spillway controls 50 yards away, accompanied by County Engineer Stevens, Colonel Patterson with his documentation cameras, and Deputy Sheriff Clark, who'd arrived to ensure public safety during the maintenance operation. At exactly 11 a.m., I keyed the radio to Stevens. "County Engineer, this is the Morrison Property Flood Control Coordinator. Beginning routine system maintenance as scheduled." "Confirmed, Mr. Morrison. You are authorized to proceed with approved maintenance operations under the 1923 water management contract." The first spillway gate opened with the deep mechanical groan of Depression-era engineering coming to life. The sound carried across the water like the voice of mechanical gods, causing several guests to look around in confusion. Water began flowing into the underground drainage system with a satisfying rush that reminded me of my grandfather's stories about taming spring floods. The lake level dropped noticeably within the first 10 minutes, causing the restaurant platform to settle slightly as its flotation decreased. "What's happening to the water?" someone called from the floating platform, but Cordelia quickly dismissed their concerns as natural lake circulation patterns. The TV news crew began filming what they assumed was interesting background footage of water management operations, completely unaware they were about to broadcast the most expensive restaurant failure in state history. At 11:15 a.m., I opened the second spillway gate. The lake level dropped 2 feet within 20 minutes, causing the restaurant platform to tilt as its supports contacted the lake bottom. Expensive kitchen equipment began sliding across tilted counters, while servers struggled to keep champagne glasses from rolling off increasingly unstable tables. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Thompson called out nervously, "perhaps we should discuss this unusual water situation with the property owner." That's when I walked to the crowd with my grandfather's 1923 water management contract in hand, Deputy Clark at my side, with official documentation of the legal maintenance operation. "Good morning, everyone," I announced through my own microphone, my voice carrying clearly across the still draining water. "I'm Jake Morrison, owner of this property and the county-designated flood control coordinator for this watershed." I held up the yellowed contract documents. "Under the authority granted to my family in 1923, I'm conducting routine maintenance on our emergency spillway system. This drainage operation is completely legal and has been properly coordinated with county officials." Cordelia's face went through more color changes than a sunset as she realized what was happening. "You can't do this. I have guests. I have investors. This is community property now." "Ma'am," I replied calmly, "this has never been community property. You've been operating an illegal restaurant on private land, using forged permits and stolen investor money." The third spillway gate opened with another mechanical groan, and the lake level plummeted another 3 feet. The elegant floating restaurant settled into the mud with a grinding crash that echoed across the water like the sound of dreams dying. Catering staff abandoned ship, wading through knee-deep mud while carrying salvageable equipment. VIP guests fled across the tilting platform in their formal wear, champagne bottles rolling around the deck like expensive bowling balls. Deputy Clark stepped forward with his radio. "This is Unit 12. I need backup at the Morrison property. We have a situation involving fraud, trespassing, and about 200 angry people in evening wear." The TV news crew captured everything as Cordelia's perfect composure finally shattered completely. She screamed at construction workers, threatened county officials, and accused me of destroying community progress through domestic terrorism. That's when Agent Sarah Samuel of the FBI Financial Crimes Unit arrived with a warrant. Cordelia Blackthorne, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, she announced while the news cameras rolled. As they led Cordelia away in handcuffs, she screamed one final threat. "This isn't over, Morrison. You'll pay for destroying my vision." I looked at the expensive restaurant platform sitting helplessly in 3 feet of mud, then at my grandfather's spillway system that had worked perfectly after nearly a century. "Ma'am," I called after her, "my grandfather built this system to last forever. Your restaurant was always temporary." 6 months later, I stood beside the refilled lake, watching families enjoy the first annual Sarah Morrison Conservation Festival. The water had returned to its crystal clarity within 2 weeks of the restaurant removal. My grandfather's natural spring system quickly restoring the ecosystem that had thrived here for generations. Fish populations rebounded, migrating birds returned, and the memorial wildflowers Sarah had planted bloomed more beautifully than ever. Cordelia Blackthorne pled guilty to 15 federal charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. She received 4 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to the investors she'd defrauded. Her house sold at auction to cover legal costs, with the proceeds barely scratching the surface of what she owed. The HOA dissolved immediately after an audit revealed she'd embezzled over $200,000 from community funds for personal expenses and restaurant construction. Several board members faced civil lawsuits, though most were eventually cleared when it became obvious they'd been manipulated by a professional con artist. But the real transformation came in how the community healed itself. Longtime residents who'd remained silent during Cordelia's harassment campaign stepped forward with apologies and offers of support. Tom and Martha Hendricks organized a group of original neighbors who helped me establish the property as a conservation education site. "Jake, your grandfather's flood control system saved our farms for decades," Tom said during our planning meetings. "It's time we properly honored his contribution to this community." County officials formally recognized the historical significance of my grandfather's engineering work, designating the spillway system as a protected historical landmark. The 1920s water management contract was updated to include educational provisions, allowing school groups and engineering students to study Depression-era infrastructure. Stevens, the young county engineer, helped me develop educational programs about sustainable water management and flood control systems that don't rely on modern technology. We've hosted dozens of field trips where kids learn how gravity, mechanical advantage, and careful engineering can solve problems that electronic systems can't. The memorial garden where Sarah's ashes rest became the centerpiece of our conservation education efforts. Native plant workshops, bird-watching groups, and environmental science classes now gather monthly under the ancient oak, where we'd carved our initials decades ago. Local media coverage of the restaurant disaster evolved into positive stories about historical preservation and community conservation efforts. Rebecca Walsh's feature article about my grandfather's flood control system won a state award for historical journalism and brought visitors from engineering schools across the region. Even the economic impact exceeded expectations. Property values increased after the conservation designation. Eco-tourism brought steady revenue to local businesses, and the annual festival attracts hundreds of families interested in environmental education and Depression-era history. The Sarah Morrison Conservation Scholarship Fund, established with donations from grateful community members, provides annual support for students studying environmental engineering and water management. 3 local kids have received college funding to pursue careers in sustainable infrastructure development. On quiet mornings, I still sit on the same weathered dock where Sarah and I shared 30 years of sunsets. But now the peaceful water hosts educational canoe trips and conservation workshops that would have made her proud. The floating restaurant platform was recycled into materials for the new Environmental Education Center, where visitors learn about the delicate balance between development and conservation. Ironic that Cordelia's monument to greed became the foundation for community education about environmental responsibility. Federal prosecutors used our case as a model for investigating real estate fraud schemes targeting elderly property owners. Agent Samuel told me that Cordelia's conviction helped build cases against similar scams in 6 other states, protecting countless families from the same harassment we'd endured. Most importantly, I found my purpose again. Teaching kids about water conservation and showing them how their great-grandfathers solved engineering problems connects me to both Sarah's memory and my grandfather's legacy in ways I never expected. The lake remains as peaceful as Sarah wanted, but now it serves the entire community through education rather than exploitation. Every month brings new visitors who learn about sustainable water management, historical engineering, and the importance of protecting natural resources for future generations.